Alright, hello, welcome. We are talking about the American Revolution. Just so you know, I am recording this while I have a cold, while I'm in my apartment, and while my dog is consistently playing with toys. So, if she's annoying, I'm sorry. She's the one who's interrupting me. Alright, so this is the thing that a lot of Americans think is the most important part of U.S. history. I disagree. However, we will have to cover it because, heck, it's what starts the U.S. history anyway. Alright, so let's start with when the colonies were still under English control. Remember, Virginia was established in 1607, Massachusetts Bay Colony was 1620. The American Revolution doesn't happen until 1763-ish. So, during this time, colonists were under something called salutary neglect, which is that when Britain would pass laws, whether it was the king or the parliament, they were laxly enforced. Essentially, that means they kind of were ignored. Colonists could get away with all kinds of things, such as trading with other empires, not paying taxes, yada yada, because England was kind of like, we don't have the resources to make sure that we actually enforce any of the laws we're passing in the colonies. Alright, this changes after the French Indian War. That's why it's a turning point. First thing, the Navigation Acts were enacted in the 1600s. It essentially meant that colonists couldn't trade with other empires. That being said, because of salutary neglect, the Navigation Acts were not really followed too much. That's not until 1763. So Proclamation of 1763, as a reminder, is that boundary line that says colonists cannot settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. A lot of colonists wanted to anyway. However, they were being enforced by the British to not do that. Also, to help pay for the debt that came from the French Indian War, the British passed the Stamp Act. It was a tax law that required colonists to purchase special stamps to prove payment of tax, especially on paper goods. Colonists reacted pretty poorly, and they boycotted, which means they avoided buying British goods, and prepared a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This is where the Sons of Liberty and Daughters of Liberty came about, and they started protesting. The boycotts were effective for the Stamp Act, and they were repealed. After that, Britain passed the Townshend Act, which is when they taxed certain colonial imports, such as glass, paper, and tea. Colonists protest about taxation without representation because of this. And that basically means colonists weren't represented in Parliament, which is like Congress in Britain. Instead, they were getting passed laws without having any way of saying what laws should be passed for them. Because of this, a lot of founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Patrick Henry all came together and they began communicating with each other about various ways to protest. The next few slides will go over the other events that are listed here. Okay. So then the Boston Massacre happens. In response to sort of the colonial protests, Britain began sending troops. They came to Boston. British troops were taunted by an angry mob. Troops began to fire in the crowd, and they eventually killed 5 colonists. Almost sort of like propaganda, colonists labeled it as a massacre. If you're asking me, 5 colonists isn't really much of a massacre, so I don't know. The colonists won that one as far as the information goes. Okay, Britain then passed something called the Tea Act, which shut colonial merchants from selling tea with other empires, and instead only Britain could sell tea, and all colonists had to drink British tea. In protest of the Tea Act, colonists snuck aboard a ship and dumped tea into the Boston harbor in protest. Pretty big deal, the Boston Tea Party. There's a political party in the United States right now that's called the Tea Party, and a lot of their ideals, they kind of draw from the roots of the Boston Tea Party, which is interesting. Little way that history keeps coming up. Alright, after the Boston Tea Party, King George III was super angry at the colonists. Like, how dare you throw tea over? So he tightened control over Massachusetts in particular and closed the Boston harbor to move troops in. That image on the left is sort of like, it looks like someone's forcing a Native American to do something. At the end of the day, like, not gonna lie, I think the colonists were kind of a bunch of babies. Like, they were basically just complaining teenagers about everything. But heck, it worked. So after the Intolerable Acts, colonial leaders came together And they had the First Continental Congress, which drew up a Declaration of Rights. And we'll go into the Continental Congress next. So the Continental Congress drew up a Declaration of Rights, and they debated about what type of petitions to write to the British government, what letters, stuff like that, and they decided what actions need to be taken to protest the monarchy. However, they weren't quite ready to declare independence yet. They still just wanted to see how they could work with Britain. This comes to Lexington and Concord. So more British troops were being moved into Massachusetts. And British troops started to march to Concord, Massachusetts to grab colonial weapons from all the colonists. Colonial troops, also known as the Minutemen, intercepted the British and engaged them in battle. Lexington and Concord is considered the first battle of the American Revolution, even though the American Revolutionary War wasn't fully declared yet. Also, interestingly, the seizing of weapons is something that led to the Second Amendment. Like, the purpose of it was so that, like, the British the colonists were scared of seizing of weapons because the British were trying to do that. So just like a little interesting tidbit about the purpose of the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms. Great. So even though Lexington and Concord happened, you still have some people that are like, nah, is a revolution worth it? Like, is it actually something that's important? So this dude named Thomas Paine comes out and argues that independence from England needs to happen. Like, it has to. Like, there's no other possible way to live in colonies and be controlled by England at the same time. And he also argues for the creation of a democratic republic, which essentially means that colonists elect representatives to vote in the government for different laws and things. Sorry, my dog's distracting me, so I'm having a hard time speaking. And I'm sick, right? So whatever. Alright, that being said, even though common sense came out, support was all over the place. You had 40% of colonists who were patriots, not the New England patriots, but similar, right? Yeah. The Patriots believed in American independence. They were really ready and willing to fight and die for it. 40% of colonists were neutral. They kind of were like, don't know if I really want to die for it, but I don't really care either way. 20% were loyalists, and loyalists supported the British government, did not want independence, and wanted to continue being a colony under the British monarchy. After Lexington and Concord, the Second Continental Congress came together. They had enough patriots to say, like, all right, time to declare independence. And so with that, they drafted the Declaration of Independence, one of the most famous U.S. documents. Nicolas Cage tried to steal it in a movie, all that stuff. Okay, so talking about the American Revolution, there were colonial advantages and disadvantages. The advantages the colonists had were a few. So they were on their own home ground and territory, right? Like, they knew this land. The British didn't. They were living all the way over on the other side of the Atlantic in England. They had good leadership. For example, George Washington, who fought in the French and Indian War. He was super inspirational, super great at leading the military. They had a good reason to fight. Like, fighting for your independence is a little different than just fighting to fight. So a lot of people were super invested. And then finally, they used guerrilla tactics, which is essentially prevented them from fighting in a normal battlefield at the time. They would kind of do like hide and scare sort of things. And eventually they aligned with France. The disadvantages that colonists face: they had no central government, so they had no one leading them, telling them what to do. There was a shortage of food, weapons, all the things necessary to fight a war. And most of the soldiers who actually fought in the Revolutionary War were unchained. Like, it was farmers who decided, like, oh, I'm going to actually support the war for independence, and they haven't done much. Sorry, my dog is very loud and not very cool, but we're just going to roll with it. She's playing by herself. Alright, Valley Forge is an example of why colonists were at a disadvantage. It was a long battle. They were starving. They were freezing. Like, oh my gosh, they thought they were going to end the war. But, surprise, the colonists actually win. The end of the war is technically around 1781. That's when colonists won the Battle of Yorktown. Then Britain and the colonists went to the negotiating table and came out with the Treaty of Paris, which ended the American Revolution in 1783. America was granted full independence. They were able to have all of their colonies that were east of the Mississippi River, and all British troops were removed from the colonies. All right. Hopefully you enjoyed this lecture and hearing my dog act like a crazy person. Anyway, we're going to move on. Make sure you took Cornell notes on it, and I'll close out with some Green Day.